Hello, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak at this colloquium. As a Newman and not an Agnes Martin scholar, which you will probably notice right away. And I have to apologize for this image. I'm very thankful for Tiffany Bell to have pointed me at least to any kind of image of Tundra. But as you can see, this is a scan of one of the illustrations of the image of the painting, and it's not very good. You can't really see much, but just to give you a bit of an understanding. In 1967, right before she left New York, Agnes Martin finished a painting she called Tundra. It is among the last paintings she produced before her 6-year hiatus from painting, and it shows the self-inflicted restriction of her pictorial vocabulary at its most advanced stage. Tundra is structured, as you can't see, in 6 rectangles by a single horizontal and 2 vertical pencil lines, which gently mark the near white ground. And it's a black and white image, so it doesn't really look near white either. The lines touch the very edge of the canvas. They map the entire surface without ever defining a figure against a ground. Much has been made of this painting, as it holds a prominent position in Martin's oeuvre, marking the end of one working period, which would be followed years later by a significantly modified approach. In the intervening years, from 1967 to 1973, Martin shifted her focus from aesthetic to theoretic practice. She elaborated on her work in notes and journal entries. A first selection of these notes was included in the catalogue of her retrospective at the Institute of Fine Arts in Philadelphia in 1973. And in 1991, the texts were published by Dieter Schwarz as a collection, as you all know. Despite, or maybe because of their idiosyncratic prose, they have since served as a shorthand for the interpretation of Martin's work. The painting's title, Tundra, also played a role in this subsequent critical acknowledgement as a key work for the understanding of Martin's artistic aims. Tundra seemed to connect her highly abstracted pictorial language back to natural phenomena. It aligned the painting's undetermined meaning comfortably with Martin's biography, as the daughter of a wheat farmer in the rural plains of Saskatchewan, Vancouver. The artist's early experience of the Great Prairies was swiftly conflated with the aesthetic experience of her abstract painting. Martin's choice of title might also be a nod, however, toward the work of her contemporary Barnett Newman, whose work she greatly admired and whose impact on her own thinking about painting she readily acknowledged. 17 years earlier, in 1950, Newman had called one of his paintings Tundra as well. This particular year also marks a decisive moment in his artistic development. And I've chosen, even though this looks kind of funny, to show you the formats of the paintings side by side. So, you won't understand them as being the same size, because I think it's really important to know how much he changed the dimensions of his paintings. In 1950, Newman arrived at his pictorial vocabulary of zip and field, which he had carved out for the first time in the painting 1:1 2 years earlier. While this initial application of the vertical color band is clearly related to the later Tundra, 1:1 is just as definitively still connected to traditional easel painting, as the gestural marks and also the relatively small canvas size show. In the years bridging these two paintings, Newman was more productive as a writer than as a painter. With texts such as The First Man Was an Artist, The Ideographic Picture, or The Sublime Is Now, he provided the terminology that has subsequently been used by critics, art historians, and fellow artists to inscribe meaning into his highly abstracted color fields. In 1950, the year Newman painted Tundra, proved to become the most productive year in his career.
Entschuldigung, könnten Sie vielleicht die beiden Lampen rechts und links ausmachen, weil die machen den Kontrast zunichte, den wir durch die Dimmung des Saallichtes erreicht haben.
Das müssen Sie dem Herrn sagen.
Besser sehen, wenn Sie die beiden Lampen ausmachen oben. Die beiden Lampen oben.
Ja, ich kann das nicht machen, das macht der Okay. Dankeschön. The vigorous application of the zip form on the canvases of extreme formats in print and also in sculpture was thus accompanied by texts that Newman had written during the preceding years about the meaning of his artistic practice. There are many similarities and also many differences between the written statements of Agnes Martin and Bernd Newman, and I will touch on some of them in the coming talk. However, the most salient question, in my opinion, is that of how the discipline of art history has come to terms with the artistic self-interpretation of both artists. The critical reception of Newman and Martin has from the beginning been thoroughly steeped in their own comments and terminology. Some authors have focused specifically on the rhetorics and sources of the artist's texts in order to develop a critical distance. Peter Schneemann for Newman, for example, or Jacqueline Bass for Martin. However, this focus in turn often ignored the painterly practices of Newman and Martin. Art history still struggles to find a methodology that respects artists' writings as historical source material without elevating them to serve as the key for an artwork's meaning, and without dismissing them as a parallel but largely independent discourse. In order to bridge that gap, I propose to take seriously the specific aesthetic experience that both Newman and Martin try to describe in their texts, and to contextualize the vocabulary they use for this task. With this, I will demonstrate the ongoing discourse on meaningful abstraction that connects Newman's and Martin's artistic and aesthetic practices over the 2 decades, from 1950 to 1970, which arguably are the watershed moment between modernist and postmodernist understandings of art. In the following, I will focus, due to time limits, on 2 functions that Newman's and Martin's texts share, despite their obvious differences in tone and also in intended audience. First, their struggle to inscribe meaning into their highly abstracted paintings via the level of experience. And second, the necessity to differentiate their work from a formalist understanding of abstraction. Let us begin with the title Tundra. For both Newman and Martin, the Canadian prairie served as a biographical evidence for their investment in a particular form of experience, which they connected to this open space. In numerous texts and interviews ranging from the late 1940s to the 1960s, Newman named the vastness of the tundra as the experiential equivalent to what he had in mind with his painting. The whiteout effect during a snowstorm in Canada, for example, when all orientation is lost because the horizon line, is no longer visible. Martin, in early interviews, regularly evoked the place of birth, Saskatchewan, and her childhood in Vancouver, and she described her experience of the vast wheat fields in the Great Prairie. Her allusion to these expansive natural spaces, which she would take back a bit later on, seems to serve as an interpretatory key to the evenly structured surfaces of her paintings. Newman's Tundra from 1950 is a high rectangular canvas painted in bright orange hue. A narrow vertical strip of burnt ochre segments off a third of the canvas's length at what is its golden section, though laterally reversed. Newman arrived at this allocation of the colored fields by building up numerous layers of paint on top of each other. The burnt ochre served as an underpaint for the luminous orange. On top of this layer, Newman applied a strip of duct tape before continuing to cover the canvas with broad brushstrokes. He later removed this tape to leave the narrow zip traversing the orange field in its vertical expansion. The zip is thus quite literally an opening into another pictorial space, beyond the one alluded to in the orange field. At the same time, due to the scrutiny it invites, as the only pictorial element contrasting the orange expanse, the viewer understands its position on the picture surface. Instead of a glimpse into the void beyond, it is then a very shallow relief, built up by layers of color. The ambiguity of this pictorial element is further enhanced by its color. The stark contrast to the surrounding field is a reminder of the conventions of drawing, the gestural mark on the canvas. Its verticality, cutting through the entire height of the canvas in machine-like precision, as well as the fact that the burnt ochre is surrounded by orange rather than marking its surface, works against this conventional understanding of form and composition. The zip is doubly inscribed as both illusionistic opening into a pictorial space beyond the painting's surface and as a literal gap between two fields of orange. It is both a painterly mark on the canvas and a semi-mechanically produced strip beneath the orange expanse. The visual experience dissolves into a process of divergent realizations while one moves closer, steps back, walks along the expanse of the canvas, or looks at it from the side. Like Eva Ehninger, I would argue that it is really this self-reflexive visual experience, the experience of seeing and of making sense of what one is seeing, or of not making sense of it and becoming aware of that, which might be described as the meaning of Newman's painterly practice. I'm sure that you have already noticed that Kaya Linville makes a quite similar observation in her analysis of Martin's Tundra in her review in Art Forum in 1973. And I quote, "Tundra is a simple, almost inexplicable canvas. The pattern reminds you of a window, but the surface is closed. It suggests a heavy, white jade blankness of snow sky, which would be the whiteout effect or almost happening. The line that divides it are dominant at close range, but something very particular happens when you move back from the canvas. The halos actually swallow the lines at middle distance, leaving only their white ghosts, and even the ghosts disappear eventually." Newman's own allusion to tundra seems to be aimed at capturing this painterly task. The tundra is a natural phenomenon that cannot be perceived as an entity. It is formless, a quality which, according to Immanuel Kant, is the prerequisite to initiate a sublime experience. Whereas, according to Kant, the beautiful is connected to a form of an object, the sublime can only be experienced vis-à-vis the formless. Newman, in his essay "The Sublime is Now," directly aligns the intended experience in front of his work and the existential experience made in vast and frighteningly boundless natural surroundings. The title alludes to this meaningful transcendental experience, which, according to Newman, is triggered by his paintings. Newman's essay defines this experiential realm as the driving force, not just of his own artistic practice, but of all current American painting. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm a bit lost. This leads me to the second task of Newman's title. It allows him to distance his painterly work from the modernist tradition into which he is readily placed by his peers. Newman had no interest in being integrated into that logic of self-reflective formalism which his critics Clement Greenberg and Michael Fried championed in their interpretation of late modernist painting. He very purposefully worked against this interpretation in his statements. Martin's need to describe her painting as being more than a purely formal activity and to pinpoint their meaning in the experience to be had while viewing them runs parallel with Newman's efforts. Like Newman before her, Martin found a personal pictorial vocabulary which challenged the figure-ground relationship of conventional painting. Her narrow lines, which she applied to the canvas with help of a ruler or string, or cut into the surface, or arrived at by applying a regular pattern of rectangles, can be described as a similar device to criticize the convention of mark-making as Newman's taped zip. Newman's term zip implies the possibility of opening and closing a textile, so zipping up a textile, in order to present the layer underneath. And he describes this himself. Martin's canvases are also compared regularly with a weave to describe the continuous spatial forth and back one experiences when looking at her painting's surfaces. In both Newman's and Martin's case, the analogy points toward the dynamic process of viewing a canvas. The viewers are motivated to look closely at the zip or the grid, those places on the canvas where the conventions of pictorial space seem to apply. The understanding of a mark made on a picture plane is undermined, however, by its pseudo-mechanical processing through tape and ruler, and by the fact that the zip is actually a window onto a layer of paint underneath a color field, or in Martin's case, that the grid is constructed by regular emissions of mark making. Both artists invoke the modernist vocabulary of shape and form, while at the same time subverting it, and in both cases, this formal decision leads to an open-ended visual experience, heightening the audience's visual alertness. This self-reflexive process of perception is what Newman and Martin describe with their allusion to the Canadian plains. Poor visibility, writes Bryony Fair, opens onto a heightened visual alertness that takes time to reveal itself. Newman and Martin thus searched for a fitting vocabulary to describe this process of perception in front of their painting as a quality that, in their opinion, goes beyond a formalist understanding of self-reflexive painting. Here they place the meaning of their artworks. These are meaningful precisely because they are not culled from a landscape imagery, but rather allow for an experience that runs parallel to, in Newman's words, the sublime. The powerful theoretical component, as Anna said as well, against both these artists railed was the formalist approach to their art. Formalism, however, has its own history, which proved quite dynamic in the time between 1948 and 1967, when Newman and Martin respectively wrote their statements. This becomes clear when one looks at a term that both Newman and Martin used for opposite purposes. For Barnett Newman, classicism was the term from which he distinguished his own artistic practice. In his article, The Sublime is Now, Newman dismissed the entirety of European art history as a misguided search for the expression of the absolute without loss of the beautiful form. He writes, "The invention of beauty by the Greeks, that is, their postulate of beauty as an ideal, has been the bugbear of European art and European aesthetic philosophies. Man's natural desire in the arts to express this relation to the absolute became identified and confused with the absolutism of the creative, perfect creations, with the fetish of quality, so that the European artist has been continually involved in the moral struggle between notions of beauty and the desire for sublimity." Newman pinpoints Mondrian as the endpoint of this European failure. The geometry, perfection, swallowed up his metaphysics, his exaltation, he writes. To further develop a formalistic ideal leads, in Newman's opinion, to pure ornament. In contrast, current American painting, his own painting, makes use of the pictorial vocabulary distinguished by abstraction in order to formulate new meaning. Precisely because its forms are not derived from the perception of the world, of nature, the experience it calls for can be regarded as a meaningful moment of self-recognition. For Newman, then, classicism is a negative term, which describes the dependency on a worldly motif reproduced in a painterly composition. Worried, and rightly so, that his own work is understood as a continuation of this formalist task, he pits classicist modernism against his own aims. For Agnes Martin, on the other hand, classicism is not a derogatory term at all. In her poetic essay, The Untroubled Mind, and after that in a number of other notes and texts, Martin describes what she means when using this term. Most importantly, and in sync with what Newman expects from contemporary American painting, but what he denies European classicism, Martin connects with the term a chosen distance toward the world. She writes, "My work is anti-nature," and "Classicists are people that look out with their back to the world. It represents something that isn't possible in the world." So both for Newman and for Martin, the aim is to turn away from representation in order to produce something beyond the image of the world. Newman uses for this an anti-classicist stance, Martin a classicist. Both artists agree that painting in such a way is not a private pastime, but an existential necessity. Newman aligns his painterly activity with primal human experiences. In his essay, The First Man Was an Artist, he describes the first activity of humankind as a creative act to distance oneself from undefined surroundings. He writes, Original man shouting his consonants did so in yells of awe and anger at his tragic state, at his own self-awareness, and at his own helplessness before the void. Man's hand traced a stick through the mud to make a line, before he learned to throw a stick as a javelin. And Newman ends his essay with a sentence that pinpoints his artistic self-definition. For the artists are the first men. Martin describes this existential necessity of creative production in more personal terms, but she arrives at a similar conviction. The dismissal of representation means freedom from history and from society. To free yourself from the image of the world, however abstracted, is thus a moral act, a social service. Newman and Martin were determined not to have their work subsumed under a formalist understanding of painting. Newman's unease toward a formalist interpretation of his art lightened over time, however. This becomes evident in his changing attitude towards the titles of his paintings. During the 1940s and 1950s, he chose titles that suggested an existential interpretation of his work. Genesis, the beginning, the command, day one, for example. But by 1965, he begins to question the expressiveness of these titles. In an interview with David Sylvester, he says, "I think that the painting itself confronts me as a very particular thing, and I try to give it a title which for me evokes the emotional content, and I hope it is a clue to others. But I do think that the paintings should have their impact in terms of their emotion without the title. I'm not illustrating an emotion." Newman here insists on the transcendence of his pictorial means and an existentially charged aesthetic experience on the one hand, and on the intrinsic value of the painterly object on the other. This ambivalence is characteristic for the artist's later writings. This is a very funny slide. It seems to have to do with his contact with artists such as Donald Judd, who presented Newman as a role model for current non-relational artistic practices. According to Judd, though the current developments in the US were rooted in the works of Mondrian, they completely surpassed the endeavors of European modernism. From this vantage point, so yes, Mondrian is a root, but we have completely surpassed it, this minimalist stance. From this vantage point, Newman was able not to regard Mondrian as an antagonist anymore, but rather as a counterpart in an ongoing conversation about the possibilities of abstract expression. In a number of reviews from 1965 to 1970, Judd also presented Agnes Martin as an influential, non-relational painterly position. Martin was regularly included in exhibition together with minimalists, but nonetheless sought to differentiate her work from their object-oriented pursuits. She turned to the terminology and arguments of abstract expressionism for this purpose, to the early Barnett Newman of the 1940s and 1950s. The necessity to inscribe meaning to their painterly practice is thus as pressing for Martin as it was for Newman in the late 1940s. Possibly it is even more vital, since minimalism proves to be less of a clearly defined antagonist as formalism used to be. For both Newman and Martin, the specific quality of their painterly practice is that it leads to a decelerated, deliberate experience of perception. This process, which can be described in quite formal terms, was understood as the key to a deeper, a meaningful understanding of their artistic work. A parallel critical analysis of the pictorial and the rhetorical means they employed is thus necessary to come to terms with their meaningful abstraction. Thank you.